Hello and welcome friends. I welcome you all to this course on Introduction to Political Theory, and today we are going to discuss basically the general outline of introduction theory, its method and approaches, and what are the key features of political theory. We will have one more lecture on introduction to political theory as part of the introduction to the course, where we are going to focus more on the ideology and theory and the debate between the two, and then we will conclude the next lecture. So today in this lecture we will have a kind of general outline of political theory, its method, approaches, and also the key features and why do we need political theory and so on. So that we will discuss today in this lecture. Now, as you know, the political theory is a discipline emerged in a context when there was a demand or there was a requirement to not just explain or not just explain or describe what is happening, but also to move away from more philosophical or normative concerns. So, in political theory we will come to this point again and again throughout this course, when we will discuss many concepts, ideas, terms which are essentially contested. That means there are many interpretation of such terms and concepts. So, when we will discuss those terms and concepts, we will come again to this question of normative versus descriptive distinction in political theory. So, one of the approach in political theory is to not just explain but also provide the possible answer to some of the contemporary challenges and the predicaments of social political life. So, it ravel then in the realm of normative philosophical concern on the one hand, but also in the real political problem or challenges on the other. So, in that sense the understanding of political theory is very essential, and it developed to understand or explain the social reality and provide the tool to collectively think or arrive at a solution which would be a kind of way forward from the conflicting relationship with them, conflicting relation in the realm of politics. So, let us start with the introduction of it. Political theory as a discipline is an endeavor to theorize, critique, and also provide solution to the normative, practical challenges, predicaments, and organization of political action in the past and also in the present that we inhabit. So, the task of political theory as a discipline is then to theorize, that means to make sense of, to explain, to interpret the social events or the social political issues or challenges, and not just provide the theory of it, but also it enables us to critique some of the social status or status quo and provide the alternative which should be more just, more desirable, and that will make our life more human and so on. So, besides theorizing the social political event, the task of political theory is to provide the critique. So, for example, we can think of Marxism or feminism as a critique to the existing status quo in the society or in the polity, to make it more egalitarian, to make it more inclusive, to make it more just. So, the theory provide not just a kind of theorization, interpretation or explanation, but also a critique to the social and political status quo and the alternative for a better future, for a better egalitarian and just society. So, then the inner or inherent tension in political theory is the normative concern on the one hand and the practical challenges and predicaments on the other. So, in any society, whether it is in the past or in the future, the political theory tries to provide a kind of theory or explanation or critique to the normative as well as the political challenges. That is, normative would be like what ought to do, what should be done and what ought to be done, and the practical real concern is about what is the challenge, what is the actual reality. Political theories tend to travel in both these practical concerns on the one hand and the normative moral political judgment on the other. So, it tries to provide the better solution for such normative and practical challenges and predicaments. Now, political theory is also intimately connected with the matters related to political. That is, the political, in political theory, this subject deals with the matter that is related to political, and political in itself is a very challenging, very complex and multi-layered phenomena. It transcends the limits of time and space. So, it cannot be just, when we talk about political, we cannot reduce the political merely to the state or to its institution or administration or constitution. So, the sphere of politics transcend different space and time, and we are all in a way shaped by the political development or political challenges or political discourses that is happening all around us. So, whether we like it or not, political is something which we are all engaged in, consciously or unconsciously, we all participate in it. There is no way we can remain indifferent to the issue of political. So, in the words of one of the greatest political theorists, Aristotle, that man is June politican, that means man is by nature a political animal. So, the question of political and the matters that is related to political is something which theory deals with, and there we have to make a distinction between theory and thought and theory and philosophy. So, all these disciplines like political theory, political thought and political philosophy deals with political or deals with politics, but their approach, their engagement with the political is different. Here the political theory tries to, as I was saying in the beginning, to not just help us in explaining or interpreting the political event, that means theorizing any event or any reality, but also it provides the critique and the possible alternative to make the world more just, more egalitarian and so on and so forth. So, this political, I will come to this question again in when we will discuss political theory and political ideology and also later part in this lecture, but here we need to understand the expansion or the vastness of this term and also the complexities that is involved. So, it cut across both the private life of the individual and citizen and the public life of the nation and the state, and in both the realms, especially when we take the example of feminism and so on, we understand the family also as the realm of politics, patriarchy, gender and so on and so forth, how it is consolidated in the realm of family, then in the society, and then also reflected in the state and so on. So, political in that sense cut across the boundary of private and public, national and international, state and institution on the one hand, society, culture and so on and so forth. So, political theory as a discipline then deals with the issue of politics, and that is why political theory has also a kind of multi-layered engagement with the issue of politics, and it is very difficult and challenging to reduce it to any one set of core ideas or beliefs or approaches and methods in political theory that we will discuss. However, in terms of traditions, methods and approaches, it varies. As I was saying that the subject of study in political theory is matters that is related to politics, which is itself a very dynamic, complex and multi-layered phenomena which cut across different sphere of our individual and collective life. Now, when political theory engages with this vast sphere of individual and collective life, it necessarily requires, and it is the characteristic of political theory, that in terms of its tradition, method and approaches, it varies, but its major concern are some of the following, like the nature of a state and politics in any society. So, it deals with the question of a state, its nature, whether it is a secular state or a theocratic state, modern state, what are its features, whether it is a democratic state and so on and so forth. Then the question of freedom, equality and justice. Some of these terms we are going to discuss in this course, and we will come to it in the next lecture, and I will give you the brief outline of this course as well, after discussing the relationship between theory and ideology. So, some of the major concerns, despite of its varieties of approaches, concerns and method and tradition in political theories, are nature of a state and politics in any society, questions of freedom, equality and justice, the idea of democracy, secularism and religious way of life, rights, obligation and public good and so on and so forth. So, there can be as many subjects as it is related, or those subjects are related to the question of or phenomena of political. And a political is a bit complex, a bit indeterminate or dynamic phenomena, and as I was explaining that it cut across various disciplines or various boundaries, and therefore political theory deals with all those subjects that is related to or connected to this phenomena called political. So, it is interdisciplinary in nature, and there is no one dominant or exclusive method of analysis in political theory. So, there is no one singular dominant and exclusive method and approaches in political theory. So, you have a kind of interdisciplinarity in the very nature of political theory. So, it is both a normative and explanatory in nature, as I was saying, that it deals with the normative question of ought to and what we should be doing, how we are ought to behave in our interpersonal relationships, and also in our relationship with the state and its institution and so on. So, it deals with the normative concerns and normative questions on the one hand, that is not exactly about how we are actually governing or behaving in our interpersonal relationship or in our relationship with the state, but how we are ought to behave in our interpersonal relationship or in our relationship with the state or society or community and so on. So, it is both normative and also explanatory in nature. Political theory, although accused of normative thinking with little or no relevance to the practical lives of the individual and society, do engage with the practical challenges and provide tools and resources for not only explaining the various predicaments and challenges of social and political life, but also for forming better judgments about the same. Now, let me explain this point a bit more. That is, that often there is a kind of criticism leveled against the political theorist or those who are engaged in political theory, that they are excessively obsessed with the normative concern, which has very little or no relevance in the practical life of the individual and society. So, why we should bother about what ought to be and what we should do and so on? We are bothered about the practical problem. And here we also need to recall the political science is about the art of possible. It is a pragmatic science. In that way, deals with the achievable, which is pragmatically possible. Whereas in philosophy or in political theory, especially in its normative obsession, there was an era this charge was leveled against the political theorists, that they are excessively obsessed with the normative concerns and the questions which has very little or no relevance in the actual pragmatic practical life of individual and society. So, why we should study political theory? But contrary to that, I will argue, and as we proceed in this course, we will come to know that political theory is not just about normative concern or normative questions, but it also deals with the pragmatic questions, the pragmatic issues, and it provides then not just the solution to those pragmatic issues or pragmatic concerns, but also enable us to develop sound judgment about some of the major contentious issue in the politics and society. So, in any society, for example, whether there should be ban on burqa, or whether some temples should be open for the women, how we can make the society more just, should we justify affirmative action or reservation to make the society more egalitarian, and so on. These are some of the contentious issue before any society or a polity. Now, as an individual, to develop your own judgment on these issue, you not just require the contemporary opinionated kind of understanding of the issue, but to understand the larger and deeper inherent normative concerns associated with these issues. So, for example, whether the temple should be open for the women or not cannot be explained through the perspective given by, say, ritualistic or a kind of traditionalist argument, where they believe that it is the practice that women should not enter the temple. But then if we also believe that there should be a kind of gender justice or women equality and empowerment, and women have the right, not just the kind of charity or kind of we enabling them or empowering them, but as an individual in a secular state which recognize individual with certain fundamental rights, women do have rights to enter into the temple and so on. So, the point through this example I am trying to make is that political theory enables you to not just make sense of the political challenges and the political predicaments, but to also develop a more sound judgment about the contentious issue. And most of the issues related to political is always by nature contentious, and there to avoid normative concerns and normative issues is simply not a desirable way to make society more egalitarian, more equal, more just, and accommodative and prosperous, and so on. So, the one of the central issue in political theory is to govern the one of the major political issues is to govern the collective life or the public life or the common life of a community in a given territory, and so on. Now, political theory, and there is a now shift away from also a kind of territorially traditionally or culturally defined notion of political theory, say Western political theory or Indian political theory, to more a kind of global discipline of political theory, and so on. So, political theory in a way help in the reassertion of the validity of normative concerns, normative questions in the contentious relationship or discourses about the matters that is related to political, and there our understanding or engagement with political theory will help us to solve these problems amicably through debates and discussions, but also enable us to have better judgment about some of these issues. So, broadly speaking, the political theory then can be understood in relation to at least three things. One is the academic disciplines, so like political science, history and political thought or philosophy on the one hand. So, we have a kind of academic discipline like political science, history or political thought and philosophy. Political theory is intimately connected with these disciplines and derive a lot of terminology, concepts, ideas and methods, also approaches from these disciplines. The second is the real practical world. All the political theorists have to engage with the real and the practical world. They cannot engage with the issue related to political by merely contemplating or speculating about it. They need to engage with the real practical world that surround them, and that makes the theory more relevant. So, the other relation of political theory besides academic discipline of political science and history of political thought and philosophy is to connect with the real practical world. And finally, that is the most recent and contemporary development in political theory, is to make a connection between the canonical political theory on the one hand. Canonical political theory I will explain on the one hand, and the contemporary developments in the subject such as feminism, critical theory, cultural studies, media studies, environmental studies and so on. So, in political theory we have as I was explaining that political is by nature a dynamic phenomena or multi-layered complex phenomena. Now, to understand that there will be a varieties of method and approaches, and there cannot be one singular dominant hegemonic and universally accepted methods or approaches in political theory. So, within political theory you have different traditions, and these traditions are also guided by ideology and so on, and there is a kind of connection with theory to ideology which we will discuss in the next class. But relatively political theory as a discipline also has some kind of relatively established canonical text or theorist, and also then the new development. Now, the task of political theory in the contemporary time is to make a connection or a relationship between the canonical political theory which we start from Plato, Aristotle, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau on the one hand, with the newer development that is happening in the political theory in terms of feminism, critical theory, cultural studies, media studies and environmental studies and so on. Now, that gives us a sense of its major icons. So, from Plato and Aristotle in the classical period to Machiavelli, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, to more contemporary theorists like Hannah Arendt, John Rawls, Michel Foucault and Habermas and so on. So, political theory is in that sense a evolutionary discipline and has its own dynamics as it study a phenomena which is also equally dynamics or ever changing. Now, to make sense of, to theorize that ever changing phenomena, political theory also evolves and acquire new tools, new approaches to interpret, to critique, to provide alternative to some of the practical political challenges. So, then it is very challenging to identify the core or the fundamentals of political theory. So, what is the basic core, what is the essential of political theory is the most challenging task. It has come a long way from its excessive obsession with the normative questions to engage with empirical questions and predicaments as I was explaining. So, no longer political theory as we see in philosophy to a great extent, and also there is new developments there, but political theory no longer engages only with the normative concern with the approach of that of a contemplative or a speculative thinker or a theorist, but it has come a long way from that kind of obsession to make it a more pragmatic, practical discipline by engaging with the empirical questions and the predicaments that a society or a community is facing, and then theorize it. And there is no kind of complete disowning of the normative concerns of political theory. It is the very basis of any kind of possible interpretation. So, we cannot simply do away with the normative issue while explaining, while critiquing the existing social political status quo. Now, that gives us a sense of the relevance of normative concerns or questions. At the same time, it is the responsibility of the theorist to engage with the real practical predicaments, and there is the that shift in the political theory, as I was saying, from its canonical existence to a more contemporary approaches in political theory in terms of new studies, as I was explaining, like critical theory, feminism, cultural studies, environmental studies, and so on. So, liberal, critical, and post-structuralist theorists have all responded to the new challenges and developments in social and political landscape, and there is a move beyond the singularity and unitary, that is, we are all understood as an individual carrying certain rights within a singular defined national territory and so on, to a more pluralistic, diverse and agnostic conception of state and politics. So, this is something which political theories and political theorists tries to engage with from a more singularity or unitary kind of approach to recognizing and accepting a more pluralistic, diverse and agnostic conception of state and politics in any society, and both liberal, critical and also post-structuralist theorists are responding to some of these new challenges and developments in political arena. So, this move from a singular unitary approach to a more pluralistic or kind of agnostic conception of state and politics, this many may see as a kind of failure of political theory, and they then want to revisit the timeless classics such as of Plato or Aristotle or Hobbes and Locke to reassert the value of philosophy, whereas many see it as a desirable and necessary development. So, there is also this debate that political theory have failed to properly explain or adequately explain the real contentious social and political life, and the reason for that is we are fragmented. We have fragmented in so many case studies or contextual studies that it is hard to generalize for a large societies or a statement which will enable us to explain other society. So, one of the defining feature of political theory, if we make a kind of distinction between say Indian politics and political theory, or American politics or British politics, the task of political theory is to give us a kind of concepts and tools through which we can explain not just a particular society, be it India or British, but it can also be equally applicable to explaining or interpreting politics in other societies. So, concepts of democracy or secularism or freedom or equality and justice is something which we can use to explain the politics in many societies and across the society. So, it transcends the limits of the context and the territory. So, in search of that kind of generalized comprehensive statement and theory, many scholars have argued that we need to revisit and reassert the value of philosophy or history of political thought to make the political theory as a grand global subject or discipline and so on. However, many Others see these development from singularity or unitary to a more kind of plural, agnostic conception of state and politics is not just desirable, but also a necessary development to make sense of the real practical world. So, this shift or evolution or move from singular unitary to more plural and diverse approach to politics and society reflects the dynamic and ever changing nature of the political. Political is not something rigid or static, it keeps changing, the landscape changes, and therefore the political theorist should also approach new methods, new approach to interpret such change or dynamism. So, however, there is this contentious interpretation of the role of political theory and its approaches that is also there in contemporary times. So, however, besides that, the major challenges before the contemporary political theorist is to move beyond the normative and help explain the realities in a particular context. But it must also transcend that context and maintain a degree of generality that defines the theory from, say, thought or Indian politics or politics in any society. So, the challenge for any contemporary political theorist is to then move away from the normative concern to a discipline which help explain the context, but also it all must transcend that context and maintain a degree of generality which then can be used to explain other societies and politics in other community or state or in society and so on. So, broadly speaking, then if you look at the kinds of theory, we can figure out three kinds of political theory. One is explanatory. So, political theory is explanatory in nature. It emphasizes on how there can be different explanations of a particular reality or particular event or particular phenomena or social political issue. So, here we can take the example of the rise of capitalism and its explanation from different theorists within this discipline of political theory. So, Marxism on the one hand says that the particular kind of social relations of production leads to development of productive forces, and it explains the rise of capitalism in relation to capital and labor forces in a free market economy. So, that is one kind of explanation to the rise and growth of capitalism in modern world. However, this same phenomena, the rise of capitalism, is explained differently by Max Weber, who believed that capitalism emerged because of the changes in the cultural domain, which was the result of transformations in the religion of some society, especially the Christian society. So, for Weber, the Protestant ethics within the Christianity emphasized on the worldly asceticism and disciplined work, which was necessary for the accumulation of capital and efficient labor force that was conducive for the rise of capitalism. So, political theory is a discipline which is explanatory in nature. It explains the social political phenomena, and that explanation can be different, as we have seen in the example of Marxism and Weberian explanation of the rise of capitalism in the modern world. The second kind of theory is or can be understood as a normative political theory, which deals with the normative questions or normative concerns as we have been discussing. So, it engages with the questions like how a society and politics ought to be governed or ought to be ruled, what ought to be the rule on which a society can be governed. So, largely it deals with the questions which is normative in nature rather than something which is actual or real. Say for the example, it deals with the question of how a society ought to be and not how a society or politics is actually governed or really governed in any given point of time. So, although it does not disregard the importance of emotions, rhetorics and use of power in decision making processes, yet it emphasizes on the logical as well as the normative arguments to arrive at a good solution of to the problem of political organization and practices. So, the political organizations and the practices in any society leads to some kind of tensions, the conflicts, the contestations among and different groups. In that kind of conflict, tensions and contestations, how we should resolve those? That we can do by participating in the political processes, political organization to political parties, and some of the parties represent certain ideology and so on, and how you should take your position on that. So, there in these processes and political organization, there is the role of emotions, there is the role of rhetorics and also the power, but it also political theory also emphasize on the logical as well as the normative arguments to provide solution to some of these conflicts and tension in any society. So, the normative and the logical part of political theory enables us to make a society better than it is, to achieve the possible and not just then merely interpret or explain the society and its polity, but also help in its transformation to make it more just, to make it more inclusive, to make it more egalitarian. And some of the political development, if you see, say the Ambedkar rights movement or feminist movement or environmental movements or groups and association fighting for environmental justice and so on, is not just then trying to explain the actual functioning of the polity in our society, but also it helps us to transform the current state of our existence, our society and so on. So, it is both explanatory and also then transformative in nature because of its normative and the logical basis. Now, the third kind of political theory can be understood as a kind of contemplative exercise, where it is contemplative in the sense of reflective and speculative in the nature, and that contemplation and reflection gives us deeper meaning to any social reality, which is not naturally available to a participant or even to the observer of politics. It is a expertise of the theorist or political students engaged in the discipline of political theory to go beyond the happenings, to decipher, to reflect on the deeper underlying structures that governs the politics or political processes in any society, and that requires a degree of reflection, a degree of contemplation and so on. So, therefore, the political theory has also a nature, an element of contemplation and speculation. So, political theory is therefore contemplative in nature. It is an intensely contemplative exercise into the common or general conditions of human beings over a period of time, and political theorists make such inquiries at different and specific stages of human lives to understand their various issues and problems. This was particularly the stand of ancient political thinkers who wanted to know about the prevalent conditions of human lives in their times. Hannah Arendt in contemporary times also believed that political theory cannot be concentrated or reduced only to the explanatory or normative understanding of it, but also it needs to have a contemplative aspect or contemplative understanding to know the world in which we human beings live in and to know the conditions and overall direction of human lives much better. So, to understand the underlying structures that governs the political processes, political development, political organization in society or a polity, we need to include the contemplative or the speculative aspect of political theory as well, beyond the normative and explanatory nature of it. So, if you look at now the history of political theory, in order to understand the emergence and development of political theory, we need to revisit this debate in early decades of 20th century between the logical positivism and philosophy. So, philosophy was a kind of discipline which deals with the question of how to lead a good life, and to lead a good life, political scientists will tell you to create a good polity. So, good life is possible in a good polity, and how to create a good polity, maintain a good polity was a collective exercise, and how to do that, that deals with the question of state, citizenship, participation in the politics and so on and so forth. So, those are some of the questions and concerns for the political philosophers. Now, logical positivism challenged or criticize such kind of engagement with the question that is related to what ought to be rather than what is what actually is. So, logical positivism believed in the empirical science and undervalued the focus on the metaphysical contemplative thinking as it was being exercised in the among the political philosophers or the thinkers and theorists as well. Now, this logical positivism influenced political science to do away with the traditional questions of political philosophy and make efforts to establish rather a science of politics and make inquiries that provide truths about the real world as it exists in a scientific and empirical manner. So, the origin of political theorists can also be traced in this logical positivism and philosophy debate in early decades of 20th century, which influenced a great deal the political scientists, and you know the behavioralism, post-behavioralism, structuralism and post-structuralism and so on throughout the 20th century was the outcome of such debates to make the political inquiry more scientific, more objective, more value free or norm free and so on. So, political theory is a discipline different from say political philosophy or political thought is then to use some concepts and terms to explain the political functioning, the political process and organization in society in a more empirical, objective and scientific manner away from the metaphysical contemplative exercise of the previous time. So, political theory is an exercise or enterprise in that direction. It is also intimately connected with the history of political thought and thinking, and there is a kind of overlaps, there is a lots of borrowing from the tradition of political philosophy and political thought when this discipline of political theory was evolving. So, in that sense it is very intimately connected with the discipline of political thought and thinking, and in that way the thinkers, text and the terms or concepts that we often discuss in the political theory, and as we will see when we will move ahead with different concepts, we will deal with many thinkers, many texts, and these texts and thinkers are part of the larger history of political thought and political thinking. So, a lot of text or terms and concepts that we often discuss in political theory are by and large derived from the relatively well established traditions of political thought and philosophy. So, according to John Donne, in order to understand the history of political theory, we need to understand the three following questions. One, what are the subject matters of the history of political theory? What are the methods of analysis or approaches to study that period of history? And how can one understand the significance of the history intellectually? Now, these three questions we will discuss one by one. One is about this subject matter, second is about method and approaches, and third is about the intellectual significance of this history of political thought. So, John Donne is someone who believe in the role of history of political thought and doing political theory by engaging with the political thinkers of the past to make sense of or better explains and provide alternative to some of the contemporary challenges and predicaments. So, if we discuss the subject matter, we find the core subject matters of political theory are relatively well established canon of works. This relatively well established canon of works, this term I should have explained earlier, but these canons are, there are some terms, some concepts, some thinkers which we will discuss again and again. So, we may vary, we may differ with their interpretation, or there are varieties of interpretation on the meaning or the interpretation of these texts. However, there is a kind of consensus, relatively common acceptance of some text starting from Plato to John Rawls, say the most recent example in 20th century, or Michel Foucault or Hannah Arendt and so on. There is a kind of well established tradition of works or thinkers that we deal with when we discuss political theory. So, from Plato and Aristotle in the 5th and 4th century BC to Cicero in the 1st century BC Rome, to Augustine and Aquinas in the Middle Ages, Machiavelli of Italian settled republics, to Baudin, Grotius, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu, Hume, Adam Smith, Bentham, John Stuart Mill, Kant, Hegel, Marx, Lenin and so on. So, these are some of the well established canonical works in political theory, and they do not share many of their assumptions or approaches to politics or the solution or alternative that they provide. But in the discussion, in the discipline of political theory, these are works or thinkers which we will come to discuss again and again as we will discuss some of the themes that we will discuss in this course, are relatively well established canonical works in the discipline of political theory, and these canonical works emphasized on the period of history and its significance, and not on this causal explanation through which the particular history come into existence. So, this history is very significant in terms of understanding the political theory and its role in explaining, interpreting or providing alternative to the contemporary challenges and so on. So, now if you look at the methods of analysis in political theory, there are numerous methods and approaches to the study of history of political theory. We can discuss some of them here. So, one is like Quentin Skinner, who draws attention to the validity of historical character of the text, and he focuses on the purpose of author and his intention behind writing any text. So, the text again for in Skinner's kind of engagement with the history of political theory is the intellectual products of the author. However, he emphasized that historical character, author's intention and the context of the text are fundamental in understanding any text. So, the historical context, characters and the author intentions are valuable source to understand the text or any historical classical text. Contrary to this approach to the history of political theory, we have thinkers like C.B. Macpherson, who give less importance to the historical character of the text and instead focus more on the historical context in which a text is written. That means, this context, according to thinkers like C.B. Macpherson, the context plays a greater role in determining the intention, the approaches, the articulation of the author. So, more than the historical character and author's intention, they focus more on the historical context in which that text is written. So, he in other words gives more attention to the social, political and economic context of the author. So, for the example, Hobbes, when he was writing the Leviathan. So, more than text and his intention, the prevailing situation of England of that time will be a better guide to understand that text and to understand the individualism that Hobbes is talking about, which Macpherson defines as possessive individualism and so on. In contrast to these two approaches to the history of political theory, we have the third approach, which focuses on the historical characters of the text with massive indifference. That means they give very less value to the historical characters or the context of these texts, and they are more open, flexible and accommodative to interpret these texts in the light of contemporary requirements or contemporary challenges. So, still other to these three approaches is now the increasing growth of conceptual or intellectual historians who uses certain terms or ideas to understand, to examine, to explore the historical political process in any society in a particular temporality. So, that is the major development in contemporary political theory, and also a kind of move beyond the excessive reliance on the Western thinkers to include Indian, Chinese, African or Arab thinkers to make this discipline of political theory a global discipline. Now, if you come to the third question to understand the history of political theory, that is the significance. The significance of this history is that not only it helps us understand these thinkers and their influence in the past, but also how it could be relevant for making sense of and interpreting our present. So, these thinkers, especially according to John Donne, is as relevant in explaining our modern contemporary challenges and predicaments of our times than perhaps they were when they were writing. So, these texts, these canonical texts or thinkers are perhaps a better guide to make sense of our contemporary challenges and predicaments, and that lies their significance of reading Plato say 2000 after they have written, 2000 years after they have written, or someone who wrote in medieval times are still relevant. So, Machiavelli, Aquinas and so on. Now, so their significance lies in the fact that they are relevant in explaining our contemporary times as well. Now, if we look at the key features of political theory, then we find that the political theory is in a sense combination of philosophical analysis of principles and empirical understandings of political processes and structures. So, on the one hand it deals with the normative questions and concerns, but also it engages with the empirical understanding of political processes and structures in any society. So, no longer political theory is merely a contemplative exercise. It deals with the actual real problem in any society, but while doing so it also uses the normative philosophical framework to engage with them, and in that sense it is both a normative discipline and also a descriptive one. It is also intrinsically hermeneutic and critical enterprise. So, political theory is intrinsically a hermeneutic exercise. Hermeneutics is a science of interpretation, and a political theory constantly tries to interpret or explain the social and political phenomena, the challenges, contentious issue of our politics and society, and it does so continuously. So, without reflecting, without interpreting, one cannot arrive at any theory or any judgment or so on. So, this hermeneutic part of political theory is very intrinsic. That is the very basis. So, it is intrinsically connected to the hermeneutic exercise on the one hand and the critical enterprise on the other hand. And the critical enterprise comes from its ability to not just understand and make sense of the present or the contemporary or the real or the actual, but also provide alternative or challenges to some of the oppressive processes or practices in our contemporary times, and that is how society moves from one stage to the next stage, to a more oppressive society, to more open or free society, prosperous society, and so on. And political theories plays a very crucial role in making any society from, say, an authoritarian absolutist monarchy to modern, free, open, democratic societies that we live. That does not mean we are not facing many challenges, but these challenges, and to make sense of those challenges and provide alternative to those challenges, requires a kind of critical engagement with some of these political theorists. We will come to discuss when we will discuss Habermas and many other critical theorists on some of the questions like public sphere, civil society, and so on. Now, political theory emphasizes on a rational argument. That means the conclusion of any argument is based on reason. However, this is not to say that philosophers completely ignore emotions, instincts, rhetorics in their theoretical inquiries. As I have discussed, that they do take into account these emotions, rhetorics, intuitions, but they move beyond these assumptions based on emotions, rhetorics, and so on, to understand any event or any phenomena logically in a rational manner. So, it aspires to find the truth objectively through the use of reason or logic, and it focuses on the assumptions and presumptions of our beliefs, actions, and practices before arriving at any reasonable or rational argument. So, the argumentation of political theorists develop by also taking into account the beliefs, practices, or actions of any individual or collective subject, but it examine the assumptions and pre-assumptions of such practices, actions, to develop a kind of argumentation which can help us to understand not just the society which a political theorist is engaged in, but also to explain the other society and so on. So, that gives a degree of generality to the political theory. Finally, it cannot be merely speculative, and it must not transcend the empirical world. The lived experience of people studied by social scientists should be considered and not to be ignored. So, they are also part of the society, and this surrounding does influence their engagement, their reflection, their argumentation, and so on. So, political theorist cannot isolate or keep himself or herself aloof from his society or her society to develop any theory. So, they need to take into account the social political realities, and these social political reality keeps changing, and therefore, the discipline of political theory keeps changing. And as I was saying, the contemporary challenge is to reconcile between the canonical established tradition of political theory on the one hand, and the newer development in the discipline of political theory in terms of media studies, critical studies, feminism, or environmental studies on the other, is the result of this continuous engagement with the newer or ever changing reality in social political life. Now, finally, this point we will again discuss in our next lecture, that is about why do we need political theory. So, the first, the world of political is indeterminate, complex, and layered. So, there are multiple layers in the political world, political structures and the processes. It is partly cooperative. So, in this political world we cooperate to maintain some order, some harmony, some peace, to bring about prosperity and so on. But this structure and processes is also partly conflictual. Political theory help us understand and explain this partly cooperative, partly conflictual nature of political arena, which is indeterminate, ever changing, complex, and multi-layered, and therefore, to understand or interpret it we need political theory. Second, concepts and terms in political theory are essentially contested concepts. So, on as we will discuss in this course, some of the theory like democracy, freedom, equality, justice, and so on, there are multiple interpretation and often contradictory interpretation of these terms. Now, how to make sense of these terms? which is essentially contested. So, in the name of national security, in the name of freedom, in the name of nationalism, you will see two parties and two set of actors often coming to a very different and altogether opposite interpretation of the political events or political participation and so on. So, political theory explain us how a concept is related to the different related to and different from other concepts. So, when we discuss concept like freedom, equality and justice, so how these concepts are interconnected and also different from each other, and singularly how each of these concepts are also essentially contested in a sense of their multiple theorization or interpretation, which we will discuss. Political theory enable us to understand these multiple interpretation or essentially contested nature of these concepts, and that help us also understand the partly cooperative or partly conflictual arena of political. Political theory is necessary to understand and analyze various national, global issues and events. It makes efficient use of case studies and examples to explain the political realities of past and contemporary times. So, through case study, through contextual studies, to historicizing one's inquiry, it tries to explain or interpret the social political events in the past or in the present in any given society. Finally, it prioritizes reason, which develops human mind, and it encourages us to think and make rational arguments. It also helps us understand not only the complexities of the politics, but also provide the resources for making a sound judgment on any contentious social and political issue. So, the major contribution of political theory is to provide us the tool to not just provide a critique to the status quo, but also enable us to have a better or sound judgment on any matters that is related to politics, which is essentially contested or contentious. So, political theory help us in making sound judgment about any contentious issue of society and politics. So, this is all for today's lecture. In the next lecture, we are going to discuss the relationship between political theory and political ideology, and why there is so many difference of approaches, methods and traditions within the discipline of political theory. And finally, we will again revisit this question of political theory and why do we need it, and also I will give you a kind of brief outline of my syllabus and the way we are going to discuss some of the themes that is part of our syllabus. Now, for this lecture today, you can refer to some of these books like John Hoffman and Paul Graham, Introduction to Political Theory, John S. Dryzek, Honing and Phillips edited the Oxford Handbook of Political Theory, and also Catriona McKinnon, Issues in Political Theory, then Norman P. Barry, An Introduction to Modern Political Theory. Rajiv Bhargav and Ashok Acharya is also a very helpful book to understand some of the themes and also what we have discussed today, and many other topics in our syllabus, Political Theory and Introduction. And then John Donne, The History of Political Theory and Other Essays, and Gerald Gauss and Chandran Gupta's Handbook of Political Theory. So, these are some of the texts which you can refer to for the topics which I have covered in this lecture. Thank you for listening. Thanks.